Fragmentary data recovered from Mechanicus, auger arrays, damaged picked captures, and post-action astropathic transcripts form the earliest coherent record of the engagement. Much of the material originates from salvage operations conducted months after the event, when debris fields around Baal Secundus and the surrounding void lanes were stable enough for systematic analysis. Cogitator reconstruction suggests multiple overlapping data losses caused by extreme electromagnetic interference, sustained bioplasma discharge, and prolonged void combat at close proximity. Surviving civilian accounts are sparse and heavily mediated, filtered through administrative interrogation protocols and memory redaction procedures. What remains is incomplete, but consistent enough to establish a reliable opening sequence. Initial picked feeds show an escalation of long-range contacts across the Baal system perimeter. These contacts were first logged by automated sentry platforms beyond the heliopause, which had not recorded comparable traffic since the Great Crusade era. Auspex signatures indicate massed bio-vessels moving in distributed formations, their vectors converging from multiple interstellar corridors rather than a single approach lane. The density of contacts exceeded previously recorded Tyranid incursions in the region, overwhelming local prediction models within standard hours of confirmation. The earliest eyewitness testimony comes from Void Station crews assigned to resource monitoring around Baal Primus. Their reports describe persistent background vibrations, pressure fluctuations within sealed compartments, and a gradual degradation of machine response. These phenomena preceded visual confirmation by several days. The Adeptus Mechanicus later attributed these effects to the approaching shadow in the warp, noting a measurable suppression of astropathic clarity and an increase in machine spirit latency across the system. Planetary surveys conducted after the fact reveal that Baal and its moons entered a heightened state of readiness before any formal declaration of war. Defensive bastions were activated, orbital batteries brought to full charge, and chapter serfs were recalled from peripheral duties. These actions were ordered without public announcement, in accordance with Blood Angels protocols designed to prevent civilian panic on already marginally habitable worlds. Atmospheric processors on Baal Secundus were adjusted to compensate for anticipated orbital debris fallout, a decision later shown to be prescient. Recovered Vox logs from the Arx Angelicum confirm that Lord Commander Dante authorized full system defense preparations once long-range auger data reached a threshold of certainty. His directive emphasized endurance rather than rapid engagement, citing the strategic necessity of preserving Baal itself above all other assets. This decision aligns with historical records of prior Tyranid encounters, in which premature void offensives resulted in unsustainable losses. Within the first confirmed week of contact, astropathic choirs across the segmentum reported increasing interference when attempting to reach Baal. Messages arrived distorted, delayed, or fragmented. Several never arrived at all. The administratum later concluded that the system had become effectively isolated before the first hostile exchange occurred. This isolation would shape every subsequent decision made by defenders and attackers alike. Environmental data extracted from Baal Secundus indicates subtle but measurable changes during this period. Local fauna exhibited erratic behavior, migrating away from traditional feeding grounds despite no immediate ecological trigger. Atmospheric sampling showed trace bioparticulates not native to the system, likely shed from forward Tyranid organisms operating at the edge of detection. These findings were only understood in retrospect, once the scale of the approaching force became undeniable. Void traffic analysis reveals that civilian and pilgrim vessels attempting to depart the system encountered increasing navigational anomalies. Warp translation failures rose sharply, with several ships lost without trace. Surviving captains reported sensations of pressure and disorientation inconsistent with standard warp travel, reinforcing the conclusion that the shadow in the warp had reached operational strength well before the main fleet arrived. By the time the first hostile forms were visually identified, Baal was already functionally under siege. The defenders had not yet fired a shot, but their strategic options were narrowing with each passing hour. The event that would later be formally designated in Imperial records as the Battle of Baal. The cause of the engagement can be traced to the convergence of multiple Tyranid splinter fleets, collectively designated as Leviathan, drawn toward the Baal system by a combination of strategic and biological imperatives. Baal held significance beyond its immediate material value. As the homeworld of the Blood Angels chapter, it represented a concentration of genetic material of exceptional interest to the Tyranid Hive mind. Previous encounters had demonstrated the resilience and combat efficiency of Blood Angel's gene seed, making it a high-priority target for assimilation or destruction. Imperial analysts later noted that Baal's location placed it along an efficient consumption corridor for Hive Fleet Leviathan, allowing the Tyranids to replenish biomass while maintaining forward momentum into Imperial space. The system's moons, asteroid belts, and minimal but sufficient population presented an optimal balance between resistance and reward. This assessment suggests that the attack on Baal was neither impulsive nor incidental, but the result of prolonged strategic calculation. Historical records show that the Blood Angels had previously drawn Tyranid attention during the defense of Cryptus and other engagements. Genetic sampling from fallen Blood Angels during those conflicts likely provided the hive mind with enough data to prioritize Baal as a future objective. The devastation was therefore the culmination of an extended predator-prey relationship, rather than an isolated invasion. The political context within the Imperium also contributed indirectly to the event. At the time of the engagement, Imperial forces were stretched thin across multiple war zones, limiting the speed and scale of potential reinforcements. Requests for aid sent from Baal before total isolation were acknowledged but not immediately actionable. This delay was not the result of negligence, but of strategic overload across the wider Imperium. The Blood Angels themselves were in a period of consolidation, with several successor chapters operating independently across distant fronts. While this reduced the immediate defensive strength available within the Baal system, it also ensured that the chapter's legacy would survive even in the event of total annihilation. This reality weighed heavily on command decisions as the scale of the approaching threat became clear. From the Tyranid perspective, the timing was optimal. The Hive fleets approached when Imperial attention was divided, communications were fragile, and the psychological impact of isolation could be maximized. The shadow in the warp was not merely a byproduct of their presence, but an active weapon, deployed to soften resistance before physical contact was made. Recovered bioscans indicate that the leading elements of the Tyranid force included specialized organisms adapted for void combat and planetary assault in arid environments. This suggests prior reconnaissance or adaptive evolution based on incomplete data, reinforcing the theory that Baal had been studied by the hive mind long before the First Fleet arrived. The convergence itself was unprecedented in scale for the region. Multiple approach vectors ensured that defenders could not concentrate their firepower without leaving critical gaps. Orbital defense platforms were forced to divide their attention, while void patrols were rendered ineffective by sheer numerical disparity. Every defensive advantage held by the Blood Angels was countered by Tyranid mass and adaptability. As the final hours before contact passed, Baal stood as a fortified but isolated bastion, its defenders fully aware that no relief would arrive in time to prevent the initial assault. The cause of the battle was no longer theoretical or distant. It was present in every disrupted signal, every failed translation, and every augur contact creeping closer to the inner system. The opening phase had ended, and escalation was inevitable. Following the confirmation of hostile contact, Imperial records shift from predictive analysis to active engagement logs. The factions involved in the Battle of Baal were defined early and with a little ambiguity. On one side stood the Blood Angels chapter, their remaining fleet assets, planetary defences, and a limited contingent of chapter serfs and support personnel. On the opposing side was a massed Tyranid force, identified as Hive Fleet Leviathan, composed of multiple splinter elements converging into a single operational swarm. No other Imperial military formations were present during the opening phase, and no external allies were able to intervene prior to escalation. The Blood Angels' defenders were concentrated primarily around Baal Secundus, which functioned as the chapter's operational and population centre. Baal Primus, largely uninhabited and environmentally hostile, served as a forward defensive buffer. Orbital infrastructure across both worlds included defence platforms, void shield generators, and macro battery emplacements maintained by the chapter and overseen by Mechanicus adepts permanently assigned to the system. The Blood Angels fleet consisted of strike cruisers, escort vessels, and support craft sufficient for rapid deployment, but not designed to repel a system-scale invasion without reinforcement. Hive Fleet Leviathan approached as a distributed organism rather than a unified armada. Biovessels of varying mass and function advanced in layered formations, with larger synapse ships protected by dense screens of smaller organisms. Auspec's data indicates constant internal reconfiguration within the swarm, suggesting real-time adaptation to Imperial sensor tracking and targeting attempts. This fluidity rendered early threat prioritization unreliable, as vessel roles shifted during approach. First encounters occurred at extreme range and were initially ambiguous. Automated defense platforms registered contact but failed to achieve consistent target locks. Tyranid biovessels exhibited irregular energy signatures and unconventional propulsion patterns, complicating ballistic prediction. When the first long-range volleys were exchanged, damage assessment proved difficult. Several confirmed hits resulted in no immediate loss of hostile mass, reinforcing concerns that standard void engagement doctrines would be insufficient. Blood Angels fleet elements were ordered to conduct limited probing actions rather than full interception. These maneuvers were designed to gather tactical data on enemy resilience, weapon output, and response behavior. Engagement logs from these actions describe Tyranid organisms closing distance aggressively, absorbing damage that would cripple Imperial vessels of comparable size. In several instances, biovessels altered course mid-engagement to pursue damaged escorts with disproportionate focus, indicating a predatory prioritization algorithm rather than conventional target valuation. As distances closed, the nature of combat shifted decisively. Tyranid weaponry relied heavily on bioplasma discharges, living projectile organisms, and corrosive spore clouds capable of degrading armor and void shields over time. Imperial vessels reported rapid shield depletion and localized hull breaches even in the absence of direct impacts. Damage control crews faced unfamiliar hazards, including organic infiltration through hull fractures and persistent biocontamination. The first confirmed loss of a Blood Angels escort occurred during one such engagement, when sustained bioplasma fire overwhelmed its shields and compromised its reactor containment. Vox records from the vessel's final moments describe internal temperatures rising beyond survivable thresholds within seconds. Recovery of wreckage later confirmed extensive internal biological infestation, suggesting that boarding organisms were deployed simultaneously with external assault. Orbital defences around Baal Primus entered active engagement shortly thereafter. Macro batteries and lance arrays achieved higher hit confirmation rates due to reduced engagement distances. Several Tyranid vessels were visibly damaged or destroyed, their remains dispersing into surrounding space. However, this success was offset by the sheer volume of attackers. Destroyed bioships were rapidly replaced by others advancing through the debris, showing no reduction in overall pressure. Hostile encounters intensified as Tyranid forces committed to full system penetration. Biovessels executed coordinated maneuvers to neutralize key defense platforms, focusing on those with the highest output or strategic positioning. Records indicate that Synapse organisms directed these attacks with precision, prioritizing disruption over annihilation. Several platforms were disabled rather than destroyed, their systems rendered inoperable through targeted biological interference. Planetary bombardment began once void superiority became contested. Mycetic spores were launched toward Baal Primus in massive quantities, saturating atmospheric defenses. Many were destroyed in descent, but sufficient numbers reached the surface to establish initial ground presence. These landings marked the transition from void engagement to planetary assault, expanding the scope of the conflict irreversibly. Blood Angel's ground forces responded with rapid deployment actions, securing key surface installations and engaging Tyranid organisms upon impact. Combat reports describe extreme close quarters fighting against rapidly adapting enemies. Tyranid organisms demonstrated high tolerance for injury and a capacity to alter behavior mid-engagement, forcing Blood Angel's units to continually adjust tactics. As hostilities escalated, it became clear that the Tyranid objective extended beyond immediate destruction. Their movements indicated an intent to exhaust defenders through sustained pressure, drawing Blood Angel's forces into prolonged engagements while additional biomasses accumulated. This approach mirrored previously recorded Leviathan campaigns, confirming the identification of the Hive Fleet beyond reasonable doubt. By the end of this phase, the Battle of Baal had progressed from distant contact to full-scale warfare across void and surface domains. Factions were fully committed, first encounters had given way to continuous hostile engagements, and the defenders faced an adversary whose numbers and adaptability showed no sign of abating. The conditions for total system devastation were firmly established. The closing phase of the Battle of Baal unfolded over an extended and uneven period, rather than a single decisive moment. Records indicate that the intensity of direct engagements fluctuated, as Tyranid assault patterns shifted from rapid expansion to sustained pressure. Void combat continued intermittently as remaining bio-vessels contested orbital control, while planetary fighting on Baal Primus and Baal Secundus became increasingly localized around strategic assets, population centers, and infrastructure critical to long-term survival. On Baal Primus, the Tyranid ground presence expanded despite heavy losses during initial landings. The arid environment, long considered a defensive advantage due to limited biomass and harsh conditions, slowed but did not halt the enemy. Tyranid organisms adapted rapidly, exhibiting modified respiratory structures and altered metabolic behavior suited to extreme heat and scarce resources. Imperial analysts later noted that this adaptation occurred faster than predicted, reducing the effectiveness of environmental attrition as a defensive factor. Blood Angel's ground forces executed a strategy focused on containment rather than territorial reclamation. Defensive lines were established around key installations, including void shield generators, communication relays, and remaining surface weapon emplacemements. Engagement logs describe continuous combat cycles with minimal respite, characterized by close quarters fighting and repeated counter-assaults. Casualty rates among defending units were severe, though difficult to quantify precisely due to the breakdown of standard reporting channels. As the battle progressed, Tyranid behavior suggested a deliberate effort to fix Blood Angel's forces in place. Attacks intensified around fortified positions, while secondary swarms maneuvered to isolate defenders from supply and reinforcement routes. This pattern reduced the defenders' operational flexibility and forced a reliance on pre-positioned reserves and limited aerial support. The Blood Angel's superior individual combat capability allowed them to hold these positions longer than projected, but at mounting cost. Orbital conditions deteriorated steadily throughout this phase. Debris fields from destroyed vessels accumulated across key void lanes, complicating maneuvering for both sides. Imperial defense platforms suffered cumulative damage from repeated assaults and biological corrosion, leading to progressive loss of firepower and sensor coverage. By this stage, the defenders no longer possessed reliable system-wide awareness, relying instead on localized data feeds and direct observation. The arrival of additional Tyranid biomasses marked the effective culmination of the assault phase. Rather than committing to immediate annihilation, the swarm consolidated its gains, reinforcing existing ground forces and tightening orbital encirclement. This shift indicated that the Hive Fleet assessed the defenders as sufficiently weakened to permit a transition towards systematic consumption rather than rapid conquest. The overall result of the event, as recorded in Imperial archives, was catastrophic but not absolute. Baal Primus suffered extensive ecological and structural damage, rendering large regions permanently uninhabitable. Baal Secundus endured severe population losses, infrastructure degradation, and atmospheric contamination. However, the Blood Angels chapter was not destroyed. Despite losses approaching levels considered unsustainable under conventional doctrine, the chapter maintained command cohesion and operational continuity. From a strategic perspective, the Tyranid advance achieved partial success. Significant biomass was harvested, and the Baal system was rendered functionally neutralized for an extended period. Nevertheless, the primary objective of total annihilation or absorption of the Blood Angels' gene seed was not fully realized. Imperial analysts later classified the outcome as an incomplete Tyranid victory, noting that the Hive fleet expended disproportionate resources relative to the strategic gain achieved. The psychological impact of the battle was profound on both sides. For the Blood Angels, the engagement reinforced long-standing doctrines emphasizing endurance, sacrifice, and defensive legacy over immediate tactical success. Survivors' accounts emphasize the sustained nature of the fighting and the absence of any clear turning point, describing instead a gradual erosion of strength, halted only by external factors beyond the scope of the initial engagement. Administratum assessments compiled in the aftermath highlight several key findings. Foremost among these was the demonstrated capacity of Hive Fleet Leviathan to coordinate multi-vector assaults across void and planetary domains with minimal degradation in effectiveness. The ability to adapt rapidly to hostile environments previously considered marginal challenged existing Imperial threat models and necessitated revisions to Tyranid response protocols. Another significant finding concerned the limits of environmental denial as a defensive strategy. While Baal's harsh conditions imposed initial constraints on Tyranid operations, these were temporary and insufficient to alter the overall trajectory of the assault. Analysts concluded that reliance on environmental factors alone cannot compensate for numerical inferiority when facing adaptive bio-threats of this scale. The performance of the Blood Angels themselves was subjected to extensive review. Combat data consistently showed superior engagement efficiency at the individual and squad level, particularly in close-quarters environments. However, these advantages were offset by attrition rates that exceeded replacement capacity during prolonged engagements. The battle underscored the vulnerability of even elite chapters when isolated from reinforcement and resupply. A further key finding involved the role of isolation prior to physical contact. The early suppression of astropathic communication and machine responsiveness significantly degraded Imperial coordination before the first shot was fired. This phase, often underrepresented in traditional battle analysis, was identified as a critical factor in shaping the outcome. Recommendations following the battle emphasized early detection and countermeasures against the shadow in the warp as a priority for future defenses. The closing records of the Battle of Baal emphasize endurance rather than resolution. The event did not conclude with decisive victory or annihilation, but with exhaustion, depletion, and strategic pause. Both sides incurred losses that altered subsequent operational behavior. For the Imperium, Baal became a symbol of survival under impossible conditions. For the Tyranids, it represented a costly engagement that nonetheless provided valuable genetic and tactical data for future campaigns. By the time active hostilities diminished, the Baal system had been irrevocably changed. Population levels, infrastructure capacity, and defensive readiness were reduced to fractions of their pre-battle state. Yet the Blood Angels chapter endured, their continued existence denying the Hive Fleet a complete strategic triumph. This outcome, precarious and incomplete, closed the first recorded phase of the Battle of Baal and set the foundation for the analytical, logistical, and speculative records that would follow in subsequent Imperial documentation. The records compiled by the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus in the aftermath of the Battle of Baal reflect a marked shift in tone from descriptive chronicle to analytical dissection. Where earlier documentation focused on events as they unfolded, these post-engagement assessments sought to quantify loss, efficiency, and systemic failure. The emphasis was not on valor or endurance, but on logistics, throughput, and the material limits exposed by prolonged isolation under hostile pressure. Administratum census efforts began while active hostilities were still diminishing. Population audits across Baal Secundus revealed casualty rates far exceeding initial projections, particularly among non-combatant labour classes essential to planetary maintenance. Atmospheric processor crews, void shield technicians and hydro reclamation workers were disproportionately affected due to their proximity to primary targets. The loss of these personnel created cascading failures in life support infrastructure that persisted long after direct Tyranid contact had ceased. Supply chain analysis identified isolation as the defining constraint of the campaign. Baal's pre-battle stockpiles were calibrated for attritional defense against conventional threats, not for sustained multi-domain warfare against a self-sustaining bioswarm. Ammunition reserves, replacement armor components, and reactive fuel were consumed at rates several orders of magnitude above baseline projections. Emergency rationing protocols extended operational endurance, but introduced secondary risks, including reduced maintenance cycles and deferred system repairs. The Adeptus Mechanicus evaluation focused heavily on machine performance under extreme biointerference conditions. Orbital defense platforms exhibited progressive degradation, not solely from physical damage, but from biological corrosion and electromagnetic disruption associated with Tyranid weaponry. Machine spirits displayed latency, erratic response patterns, and in some cases complete withdrawal from command input. Tech priests noted that standard appeasement and calibration rates were insufficient once organic contamination reached critical thresholds. Planetary infrastructure suffered similar effects. Power distribution networks on Baal Secundus experienced repeated overloads as demand fluctuated unpredictably during combat surges. Backup generators activated more frequently than designed, accelerating wear and increasing failure rates. Mechanicus logs describe several instances in which systems remained functional only through direct manual intervention, bypassing automated controls rendered unreliable by bioelectrical interference. Logistical movement within the system became increasingly inefficient as the battle progressed. Void lanes cluttered with debris forced resupply craft to take extended routes or delay transit entirely. On the surface, ground convoys faced constant disruption from Tyranid incursions, limiting the ability to redistribute munitions and personnel. Administratum planners later concluded that internal logistics degradation contributed as much to defensive strain as direct enemy action. The performance of the Blood Angels' fleet assets was assessed in terms of sortie frequency, damage absorption, and recovery capability. Strike cruisers demonstrated high initial effectiveness, but suffered from cumulative damage that could not be fully repaired without dockyard access. Escort vessels were lost at rates exceeding replacement potential, reducing screening capacity and increasing vulnerability of larger assets. These findings reinforced long-standing concerns regarding fleet sustainability during prolonged isolated engagements. A significant area of Mechanicus interest centered on the interaction between Tyranid organisms and Imperial materials. Post-battle analysis of recovered debris revealed accelerated degradation of ceramite, adamantium alloys, and void shield emitters when exposed to certain biosecretions. While such effects had been documented previously, the scale observed at Baal suggested a refinement in Tyranid biochemistry, optimized for Imperial standard materials. Administratum strategists also examined command and control efficiency under shadow in the warp conditions. The early suppression of astropathic communication forced reliance on localized command hierarchies and pre-authorized decision frameworks. While this allowed for continued resistance, it reduced adaptability and slowed response to rapidly evolving threats. Reports emphasize that decentralization preserved cohesion, but limited strategic flexibility once initial assumptions were invalidated. Resource accounting conducted after the battle highlighted the imbalance between expenditure and strategic outcome. The Imperium committed irreplaceable gene seed risk, elite manpower, and extensive material reserves to hold Baal, while the Tyranids expended vast quantities of biomass that could be partially replenished through consumption. This asymmetry underscored the unfavourable economics of attritional defence against hive fleets, particularly in systems lacking immediate reinforcement potential. Despite these findings, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus noted areas of unexpected resilience. Atmospheric processors continued functioning beyond predicted failure points. Void shields, though degraded, maintained partial coverage long enough to prevent immediate planetary sterilization. Machine spirits exposed to sustained biointerference recovered functionality once contamination was purged, suggesting that total corruption thresholds were higher than previously estimated. This frames the Battle of Baal as a logistical stress test that exposed systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated failures. Isolation, consumption, rate mismatch, and bioadaptive interference emerged as the dominant limiting factors. These impressions did not diminish the defenders' performance, but they reframed the engagement as a warning case study. Future defences against Tyranid incursions, particularly those involving isolated chapter homeworlds, would require recalibration of stockpiling doctrine, infrastructure hardening, and early disruption of enemy approach long before direct contact was made. Subsequent Administratum and Mechanicus compilations isolate several discrete engagements within the wider Battle of Baal that were considered analytically significant. These actions were not notable due to singular heroics or decisive outcomes, but because they revealed consistent patterns in Tyranid and Blood Angels' fighting styles when examined across multiple encounters. Each recorded battle contributed incremental data that refined Imperial understanding of Hive Fleet Leviathan's operational behaviour. One of the earliest documented surface engagements occurred during the defence of the Baal Primus orbital relay complexes. These installations were critical for localised command coordination once long-range astropathic contact had failed. Tyranid assault waves targeted the surrounding terrain rather than the structures directly, saturating defensive perimeters with massed organisms before committing heavier bioforms. This approach forced the defenders into sustained perimeter engagements, gradually exhausting ammunition and manpower prior to any direct assault on the objective itself. Blood Angels units responding to these attacks employed rapid counter-assault doctrines emphasizing shock, mobility, and decisive close-quarters engagement. Assault formations advanced aggressively into Tyranid concentrations to disrupt synapse coordination and prevent encirclement. Combat records indicate high initial effectiveness, with Tyranid organisms suffering severe losses when deprived of synapse guidance. However, this approach also exposed Blood Angels units to continuous attrition once replacement swarms adapted to the pattern. A second series of notable engagements unfolded in low orbit above Baal Secundus, where remaining Imperial fleet assets contested Tyranid biovessels, attempting to achieve stable bombardment positions. These void battles were characterized by extreme proximity and sustained fire exchanges. Tyranid vessels demonstrated a tendency to close distance rapidly, absorbing damage while deploying boarding organisms and corrosive discharge at point-blank range. Imperial captains noted that traditional standoff engagement doctrine provided diminishing returns against such tactics. In response, Blood Angels fleet commanders adjusted by prioritizing concentrated fire against Synapse vessels, identified through behavioral analysis rather than mass targeting. When successful, this resulted in temporary disorganization within the Tyranid formations, reducing incoming fire coordination. Mechanicus logs emphasize that these windows were brief, as secondary synapse organisms assumed control faster than previously observed in earlier campaigns. Ground combat within the Baal Secundus hive zones presented a distinct tactical environment. Tyranid organisms exploited dense urban structures to negate long-range firepower and force close-quarters engagements. Ventilation shafts, subsurface access routes, and collapsed infrastructure were used to bypass fortified choke points. Administratum assessments note that civilian architecture, not designed for sustained warfare, became a liability rather than a defensive asset. Blood Angels' fighting style in these zones emphasized disciplined aggression. Units advanced methodically, clearing sectors through coordinated sweeps rather than static defense. This approach limited Tyranid infiltration depth, but required constant forward momentum, increasing fatigue and casualty accumulation. Apothecarian recovery logs from these battles highlight the strain placed on gene-enhanced physiology during extended combat without rest cycles. Another analytically significant engagement involved the defense of atmospheric processing facilities on Baal Secundus. Tyranid forces targeted these sites with a combination of spore bombardment and direct assault, aiming to degrade planetary habitability rather than secure immediate biomass. Mechanicus observers concluded that this represented a strategic shift towards systemic collapse rather than rapid consumption. Defending forces adapted by integrating mechanized assets into infantry formations, using armored units to anchor defensive lines while infantry conducted counter-assaults. While this reduced the rate of facility loss, it increased mechanical wear and fuel consumption beyond sustainable limits. Several facilities were ultimately held at the cost of rendering associated machinery irreparable due to overuse and contamination. Across all recorded engagements, Tyranid fighting style displayed consistent emphasis on pressure, replacement, and adaptation. Losses were accepted without hesitation, provided that overall momentum was maintained. When faced with resistance patterns that produced unfavourable exchange rates, Tyranid organisms altered approach vectors, organism composition, or engagement timing rather than persisting inefficiently. Blood Angel's combat style, by contrast, relied on precision, cohesion, and individual lethality. This produced locally favourable outcomes but struggled to scale against overwhelming numbers. Administratum analysts noted that the chapter's doctrinal strength lay in breaking enemy formations rather than enduring endless assault cycles. When forced into static defence, even elite formations experienced accelerated degradation. The cumulative analysis of these battles led to several provisional conclusions. First, Hive Fleet Leviathan demonstrated improved synapse redundancy compared to earlier recorded encounters, reducing the effectiveness of decapitation strategies. Second, Tyranid objectives extended beyond immediate destruction toward long-term denial of infrastructure and habitability. Third, Blood Angel's tactical superiority remained decisive at the micro level, but insufficient to offset macro-scale imbalance. These recorded battles did not alter the overall trajectory of the campaign, but they provided critical insight into the evolving nature of Tyranid warfare. Each engagement functioned as a data point rather than a turning point, reinforcing the understanding that the Battle of Baal was defined not by singular clashes, but by the cumulative weight of sustained adaptive hostility applied across every available domain. Additional battle records compiled after primary hostilities reveal that the Battle of Baal did not consist solely of the major engagements previously analysed, but of numerous secondary and tertiary conflicts that persisted across the system. These actions were often poorly documented at the time due to communication breakdowns, yet post-battle reconstruction allows for partial assessment. Though smaller in scale, these encounters contributed materially to overall attrition and influenced the post-conflict condition of the Baal system. Several such engagements occurred within the outer debris fields formed during early Void combat. Isolated Tyranid organisms and damaged biovessels continued to engage Imperial assets, attempting salvage and recovery operations. These skirmishes were characterized by unpredictability, as Tyranid remnants operated without clear synapse coordination, yet retained sufficient lethality to threaten lightly protected craft. Administratum loss records note multiple incidents of recovery crews suffering casualties weeks after major fighting had subsided. On the surface of Baal Primus, residual Tyranid organisms persisted in subterranean and isolated regions. These organisms displayed reduced aggression compared to main assault forces, but maintained basic survival and predation behaviours. Blood Angels and Surf-led purge operations were required to eliminate these remnants, diverting manpower from reconstruction efforts. Mechanicus observers classified these actions as low-intensity conflicts, yet noted their cumulative impact on personnel fatigue and resource consumption. Baal Secundus experienced similar conditions within damaged urban sectors and industrial zones. Tyranid spores that failed to achieve initial objectives nevertheless contaminated infrastructure, requiring extensive decontamination before repair could commence. In some cases, facilities were deemed irrecoverable due to biocorrosion and structural compromise. These losses further constrained post-battle recovery timelines and increased reliance on external support once communication links were partially restored. The aftermath of the battle placed unprecedented strain on the surviving population. Administratum demographic reviews indicate that skilled labour shortages became a limiting factor in restoration efforts, even where material resources were theoretically available. Population displacement within Baal Secundus led to overcrowding inhabitable zones, increasing the risk of secondary humanitarian crises. While such issues fell outside direct military analysis, they influenced long-term system stability and defensive readiness. From a military standpoint, fleet recovery proved especially challenging. Surviving Blood Angels vessels required extensive refit, with many systems operating beyond certified tolerances during the campaign. Mechanicus dockyard reports emphasize that some damage patterns observed during Baal had not been encountered previously, particularly those involving organic material integrated into structural components. Complete removal often necessitated partial dismantling of affected sections, extending repair durations far beyond standard projections. The cumulative aftermath also revealed the psychological dimension of prolonged biowarfare. While not traditionally emphasized in administratum battle analysis, multiple reports reference declining operational efficiency correlated with exhaustion rather than injury. Commanders noted slower response times, increased error rates, and reduced tolerance for sustained engagement cycles. These observations contributed to later doctrinal revisions regarding rotation and relief requirements during Hive Fleet encounters. Final analysis conducted jointly by the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus synthesized findings from all recorded engagements. The Battle of Baal was classified as a prolonged system-scale attritional conflict in which neither side achieved full strategic objectives. For the Imperium, the primary success lay in the preservation of the Blood Angels chapter and denial of complete gene seed loss. For the Tyranids, the campaign yielded substantial biomass acquisition and valuable adaptive data despite failing to secure total system consumption. Analysts concluded that the battle exposed critical vulnerabilities inherent in defending isolated chapter homeworlds. Stockpiling doctrine, while sufficient for conventional sieges, proved inadequate against adaptive biothreats capable of sustaining pressure indefinitely. Infrastructure designed for resilience against mechanical failure was ill-prepared for organic contamination that bypassed standard safeguards. At the same time, the engagement demonstrated the limits of Tyranid efficiency. Resource expenditure during the Baal campaign exceeded expectations relative to strategic gain, suggesting that concentrated resistance by elite forces can impose meaningful costs on Hive fleets. This finding tempered earlier assumptions that Tyranid victories were inevitable once the system was isolated. The final assessment emphasized that the Battle of Baal should be studied not as a singular event, but as a composite of many overlapping conflicts whose combined effect reshaped Imperial understanding of Tyranid warfare. Its lessons informed subsequent revisions to defensive planning, logistics allocation, and early warning priorities across multiple sectors. By conclusion, the battle is no longer presented as an unfolding catastrophe, but as a completed data set. The focus shifts from survival to interpretation, from immediate necessity to long-term implication. These conclusions form the analytical foundation upon which more restricted evaluations and speculative interpretations would later be constructed, marking the transition from open record to classified review. The records attributed to the Inquisition concerning the Battle of Baal diverge markedly from those of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where earlier documentation sought clarity through aggregation and analysis, inquisitorial material is selective, fragmented, and often deliberately incomplete. These impressions were compiled from sealed interrogations, restricted sensor logs, and cross-referenced anomalies identified during post-conflict audits. Their purpose was not logistical remediation, but threat assessment beyond conventional parameters. Inquisition observers arrived after the cessation of major hostilities, operating under broad authority to examine both surviving Imperial assets and residual Tyranid phenomena. Initial impressions emphasized inconsistency. Sensor data recovered from multiple sources did not align cleanly with established Tyranid behavioral models, particularly in the latter stages of the conflict. Several engagement zones showed signs of abrupt disengagement rather than exhaustion or annihilation, a pattern not easily reconciled with known Hive Fleet doctrine. One of the earliest noted anomalies concerned synapse activity across the Baal system. While administratum analysis acknowledged redundancy within Hive Fleet Leviathan, Inquisition review suggested moments of localized synapse collapse occurring without identifiable cause. In these instances, Tyranid organisms exhibited disorganized behavior patterns before either withdrawing or becoming inert. No corresponding Imperial action could be conclusively linked to these events, and Mechanicus sensor records lacked sufficient resolution to determine whether external interference was present. Additional scrutiny was applied to warp-related phenomena recorded during the engagement. Although the shadow in the warp is a documented Tyranid effect, astropathic transcripts recovered from sealed archives describe fluctuations inconsistent with a stable hive presence. Several reports reference brief intervals of partial clarity, during which astropathic signals penetrated the shadow without identifiable disruption of Tyranid operations elsewhere. These occurrences were rare, unrepeatable, and absent from most open records. Inquisition analysts also examined casualty distribution patterns among Tyranid forces. Post-battle debris analysis revealed clusters of biomatter destruction concentrated in regions not associated with major Imperial firepower. These zones lacked corresponding weapon discharge signatures, suggesting that significant Tyranid losses occurred without direct Imperial engagement. The possibility of internal hive conflict was considered, but remains unsupported by existing Tyranid behavioral data. Ground-level observations further complicated the assessment. Purge teams operating under inquisitorial authority reported encounters with Tyranid organisms displaying atypical responses to stimuli. Some organisms failed to exhibit expected aggression, while others demonstrated avoidance behaviors not previously recorded. Genetic sampling of recovered specimens showed no clear deviation from known Leviathan strains, leaving the cause of these behaviors unresolved. Attention was also directed toward human factors within the conflict. Interrogations of surviving Blood Angels personnel revealed consistent descriptions of temporal distortion during prolonged engagements. These accounts did not suggest overt warp intrusion, but rather a loss of temporal perception inconsistent with combat fatigue alone. While such testimonies were treated cautiously, their prevalence prompted further review rather than dismissal. Certain environmental readings from Baal Secundus were likewise flagged. Atmospheric sensors recorded transient chemical signatures not attributable to Tyranid bioforms, Imperial weapon discharge, or known industrial contaminants. These readings dissipated rapidly and were not replicated in controlled post-battle conditions. The Mechanicus was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation, and the data was sequestered pending further analysis. The Inquisition also noted the absence of escalation beyond a certain threshold. Despite possessing sufficient mass to continue planetary consumption, the Tyranid force did not pursue complete ecological collapse once resistance stabilized. This restraint, whether deliberate or circumstantial, conflicted with established models predicting total resource exploitation following successful isolation. Analysts debated whether this reflected an unrecorded strategic recalibration or an external limiting factor. In compiling these observations, the Inquisition refrained from asserting definitive conclusions. Instead, the Battle of Baal was categorized as an event containing multiple, unresolved variables that exceeded standard explanatory frameworks. The lack of corroborating evidence prevented escalation to formal censure or doctrinal revision, yet the concentration of anomalies warranted continued surveillance. The closing impression of the Inquisition's initial review framed Baal not as an aberration, but as a warning. The engagement demonstrated that even extensively studied enemies could behave unpredictably under certain conditions. Whether these deviations arose from internal Tyranid adaptation Environmental interference or factors yet unidentified remains unconfirmed. What is recorded, and what remains sealed, reflects the Inquisition's assessment that the Battle of Baal contained elements that could not be fully explained, only contained and observed. The second tier of inquisitorial review concerning the Battle of Baal focuses on specific engagements and encounters that were removed from open circulation or heavily redacted in administratum archives. These records do not present a continuous narrative, but rather a sequence of isolated incidents examined for deviation from expected parameters. Each sealed report was preserved not for its scale, but for its inconsistency. One such report concerns a mid-phase engagement within the debris fields above Baal Secundus, where an Imperial escort squadron encountered a fragmented Tyranid formation operating without apparent synapse guidance. According to sensor logs, the biovessels did not respond cohesively to Imperial maneuvering and failed to exploit tactical openings that would normally invite immediate exploitation. The engagement concluded with the Tyranid elements withdrawing rather than pressing the attack, despite possessing numerical advantage. No corresponding synapse organism loss was recorded in the area. Another sealed encounter involves ground fighting near a partially ruined atmospheric processing facility on Baal Secundus. Blood Angels units reported encountering Tyranid organisms that disengaged after initial contact, abandoning viable attack routes and leaving biomass unreclaimed. Subsequent sweeps of the area revealed no hidden concentrations or environmental hazards that would justify such withdrawal. Genetic sampling confirmed standard Leviathan strain markers, offering no biological explanation for the behaviour. In a separate incident on Baal Primus, purge teams operating weeks after the primary assault documented the sudden cessation of Tyranid resistance within a contested canyon region. Vox logs indicate that active organisms became inert within a narrow time window, without signs of external assault, toxin deployment, or environmental trigger. The area showed no unusual radiation, warp residue, or seismic activity. The event was classified as biologically anomalous and archived under restricted access. Void combat records also contain instances of unexplained damage patterns. Several Imperial vessels sustained internal biocorrosion and structural compromise without corresponding breach points or boarding traces. Mechanicus inspections failed to identify delivery vectors consistent with known Tyranid infiltration methods. While minor warp fluctuation was detected during these incidents, levels did not exceed thresholds associated with material intrusion. Astropathic sealed reports provide further points of concern. During isolated intervals of the campaign, brief and unsanctioned signal clarity was recorded between Baal and nearby systems, contradicting the assumed uniformity of the shadow in the warp. These transmissions were incomplete and lacked strategic value, yet their mere occurrence was sufficient to prompt inquisitorial interest. No Tyranid activity, spike, or counter-response was observed during these windows. Certain sealed testimonies from Blood Angels personnel describe engagements in which Tyranid organisms appeared to prioritize withdrawal over consumption when confronted with unexpectedly high resistance. While tactical retreat is not unknown among hive fleets, the consistency of these reports across unrelated units suggested a pattern rather than coincidence. Inquisitorial analysts noted that such behavior could indicate temporary disruption of overarching directive cohesion. Environmental anomalies tied to specific battle zones were also recorded. In several locations, residual chemical signatures appeared and dissipated rapidly following combat. These compounds did not match known Tyranid secretions or Imperial munitions. Due to the transient nature of the readings, no samples were successfully preserved. The Mechanicus classified the data as inconclusive, but did not dispute its authenticity. A recurring feature across multiple sealed reports is the absence of escalation. In encounters where Tyranid forces possessed clear tactical advantage, they often failed to commit additional resources or follow through on potential breakthroughs. This restraint was observed in both void and surface engagements, and stands in contrast to established Leviathan behavior patterns emphasizing relentless pressure. The Inquisition deliberately avoided consolidating these anomalies into a unified theory. Each report remains compartmentalized, cross-referenced only for pattern recognition rather than explanatory synthesis. Analysts emphasized that premature theorization could distort future threat assessment by imposing causality where none had been demonstrated. The compiled record of anomalous engagements during the Battle of Baal therefore exists as a shadow archive parallel to the official history. These sealed reports do not alter the recorded outcome of the campaign, but they complicate its interpretation. They suggest that beneath the visible attritional warfare, additional variables were at play, intermittently influencing behavior and outcome without leaving clear trace or attribution. By the conclusion of this phase of review, the Inquisition categorized the Battle of Baal as a conflict containing localized deviations from established Tyranid doctrine at multiple points of contact. While insufficient to justify immediate action beyond surveillance, these anomalies were deemed significant enough to warrant long-term monitoring of any future Leviathan activity exhibiting similar patterns. The final layer of inquisitorial documentation concerning the Battle of Baal exists entirely outside standard archival hierarchies. These files are not distributed, summarized, or indexed within administratum systems. Access is restricted by individual writ, and in several cases by biometric confirmation tied to specific ordo authorities. What follows is not a narrative account of events, but a consolidation of internal judgments recorded after the cessation of all major hostilities. At the core of these classified files is a shared conclusion that the Battle of Baal cannot be evaluated solely on the basis of outcome. While the survival of the Blood Angels and the halting of Hive Fleet Leviathan's advance are acknowledged, inquisitorial review frames the campaign as an incomplete data event. The scale of loss, the variability of Tyranid behavior, and the unprecedented concentration of external interventions collectively undermine simple categorization. One classified memorandum, authored by an Ordo Xenos Conclave observer, notes that the Tyranid assault on Baal exhibited characteristics of overextension without adaptive correction. Normally, Hive Fleet Leviathan demonstrates rapid recalibration in response to resistance thresholds. During Baal, multiple points of failure were allowed to persist longer than expected. The memorandum explicitly cautions against interpreting this as weakness, instead describing it as a possible redirection of priority beyond observable parameters. Several files focus on the timing of external Imperial reinforcements. The arrival of the Indomitus Crusade elements is acknowledged as decisive in material terms, yet classified annotations question the synchronicity of their appearance. Analysts refrain from assigning causation, but note that the convergence occurred during a period when Tyranid operational coherence was already showing signs of degradation. Whether this represents coincidence or interaction remains unconfirmed. A separate classified assessment examines the Blood Angels themselves as a variable. Their unusually high tolerance for attrition during the defense of Baal, combined with prolonged exposure to Tyranid biopsychic pressure, did not produce the degree of behavioral collapse projected by pre-battle models. The Inquisition did not attribute this resilience solely to discipline or gene seed stability. Instead, the assessment records the possibility that extreme environmental and psychological saturation produced emergent adaptive behaviors at the unit level. Internal dissent is present within the files. A minority position argues that the anomalies observed during the campaign may reflect experimental evolution within Hive Fleet Leviathan, rather than disruption. Proponents of this view suggest that apparent restraint, withdrawal, or non-escalation could represent selective probing rather than failure. This position remains contested and is flagged for future correlation with unrelated Tyranid incursions. Another sealed file addresses the absence of post-conflict Tyranid resurgence in the Baal system. Despite the scale of biomass expended, no immediate secondary waves were detected. The Inquisition did not record this as relief. Instead, the absence was logged as deferred risk, with explicit instruction that the system not be used as a benchmark for successful deterrence. The classified conclusion repeatedly emphasizes limitation. Inquisitorial analysts acknowledge that their assessments are constrained by incomplete data, destroyed records, and the inherent opacity of Tyranid strategic intent. The files stress that certainty is not only unavailable, but potentially dangerous if assumed. final inquisitorial thoughts, recorded without attribution, frame the Battle of Baal as a warning rather than a victory. The conflict demonstrated that even when the Imperium survives an existential assault, it may do so without fully understanding why. The files caution that reliance on apparent success risks misreading future threats shaped by unseen variables. The Battle of Baal is therefore retained within inquisitorial archives not as a resolved case, but as a reference anomaly. Its records are preserved for pattern comparison rather than historical closure. The final directive attached to these files instructs continued surveillance of Hive Fleet Leviathan activity and renewed scrutiny of Imperial response assumptions formed during the campaign. With this classification, the Inquisition closes its formal review. No further conclusions are authorized at this time.